My name is Jaimee McGuire, and I use she, her pronouns. I am also a new member of the Springfield UU Church. While recently discussing the theme of beloved community with fellow members of the church, a thought struck me when I read a quote by Ruby Sells, in which she describes the use of the word hate and the inherent damages when we choose to start sentences with I hate instead of I love. I took a few moments to think about how, when, and why I use the word hate, and as a not so scientific project, I spent the next few days keeping track of when I said the word hate, not an easy task to tally one's own words, as well as when others around me used the word. I kept track of conversations with friends, family, and coworkers, and I was really surprised at the results. Over 3 days, I recorded 17 uses of the word hate in casual conversations, heated discussions, and even work meetings. My use of the word hate was significantly higher, even without the full capture of every use of the word. Especially concerning was my use of the phrase, I hate people, a blanket statement that conveys the idea that all of humankind is somehow my enemy. I found that most discussions with friends, family, and coworkers where hate was mentioned had to do with describing feelings and thoughts around other humans. In addition to the occasional, I hate my hair, I hate snow, and even I hate broccoli. How anyone can hate broccoli is beyond me, but that's a completely separate discussion. It should be considered, though, that hate might be an overused word, an extreme word that probably isn't accurate in truly describing a feeling or an action. Does my coworker really have such strong emotions about her hair? Does my family member really feel hostility and animosity toward a green vegetable? It seems the use of a very strong word has become commonplace. Have we forgotten the weight this little word carries? Or did we ever really even understand the weight of the word? Growing up, hate was a bad word and one that was not used freely in the home of my grandparents, with whom I spent significant time. I was taught that it's okay to not like someone or something and to express those feelings, but that's where it stops. Dislike should never cross the line and become hate. I was a slow learner, however, and I was grounded on more than one occasion for using this bad word as well as several others. We don't come into this world hating anything, though. Hate is a learned behavior or idea. As we grow and become products of our environment and cultural groups, we are taught the behaviors of hate and prejudice and bigotry, and the list goes on, by family, friends, schools, political leaders, religious leaders, and the media. Unlearning hate is possible, but we must first understand and come to terms with how and why we learn to hate. Various psychology professionals and scholars have suggested specific reasons for how and why humans hate others. Common themes include excessively high expectations of others, fear of people who are different from us, insecurities about ourselves and the inability to accept our own deficiencies and imperfections, a lack of empathy, a lack of self-compassion, a lack of interest in meeting new people or making new friends, trust issues, and an overall dissatisfaction with one's own personal or professional life. As we identify how and why we hate, we can easily see how this transitions into a co-occurring theme related to enemies. Before delving too deep into a discussion of loving enemies, however, I do want to ensure that I convey an understanding of abhorrent acts committed by humans that might prevent us from truly moving beyond a place of hate and disgust. I do not condone the actions of those who inflict harm on other sentient beings, and I do not want my words to be construed into an idea that those who commit such acts are to be excused for their behaviors. It is a universal truth that most people have enemies. We might not like this idea, but some may argue that having enemies is good. Having enemies can show us that we don't need to be liked by everyone in order to be happy and whole. But like the word hate, the word enemy seems strong and intense. A common definition of the word enemy is a person who hates, opposes, or fosters harmful designs against another. When viewed from this definition, it seems that I am the enemy. I am the person who hates. I am the person who opposes another. Over the past year, in the midst of a global pandemic and a political environment, the likes of which most of us have never experienced, I learned to hate deeper. I learned to hate deeper. I identified new enemies and I found new ways to despise and detest them. And this seems to be a pervasive theme in our country. Disturbingly, I've also noticed friends and family who normally are peaceful and calm and who exhibit loving behaviors now being more tense, sometimes negative, and even using the H word. It's thought by many that Jesus of Nazareth suggested we love our enemies, which created a new standard for relationships. Similarly, one of the tenets of Dr. Martin Luther King's vision of global beloved community is that love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. For those who get itchy thinking about loving an enemy, consider using the idea of respecting or knowing your enemy instead. If we have enemies, we hate. But is it realistic to think that we can live and function as humans and never have an enemy? A quick Google search for quotes about enemies will reveal results from religious figureheads, world leaders, and authors, all suggesting that everyone has enemies. And if someone says they don't, that should be questioned. Charles Mackay, a 19th century Scottish poet, wrote, "You have no enemies," a poem that was treasured and kept by Margaret Thatcher in her scrapbook. It reads, "You have no enemies, you say? Alas, my friend, the boast is poor. He who is mingled in the fray of duty that the brave endure must have made foes. If you have none, small is the work that you have done. You've hit no traitor on the hip. You've dashed no cup from perjured lip. You've never turned the wrong to right. You've been a coward in the fight." Perhaps those of us who think we have no enemies are blinded by our own privilege. If one feels they have no enemies, it is likely that they haven't fully heard and understood the stories of racial injustice shared by a Black neighbor, set in the pain of rejection with their gay cousin, tended the wounds of a transgender coworker after a violent hate crime has been committed, or even believed a woman recounting her experience of sexual assault or abuse. Learning about and participating in the experiences and discomfort of others will likely lead to identification and recognition of injustices and inequalities. Knowing and understanding those injustices and inequalities present in marginalized groups allows us to be able to recognize and acknowledge the enemy of Black lives, gay lives, transgender lives. On a personal note, I first began to see things from a different perspective after living on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and becoming friends with many Lakota people. Listening to the plight of others and seeing firsthand the oppression in some groups and communities gave me a better understanding of the enemies of others and opened my mind to the idea that the enemies of my friend are also my enemies. With our acknowledgement of having enemies, the next step is to fight the enemy to promote a more comprehensive beloved community. Seems a bit counterintuitive though, right? We will get to the point of loving our enemies once they are identified and we start fighting against them. This doesn't mean to go out with guns and knives and inflict violence. This means to confront and condemn the actions of the enemy. Once we have confronted the behaviors of the enemy, we are now getting closer to being in a place to love them. Back to Jesus and his idea about loving our enemies. How do we do that? How do we move from a place of negative emotion to a place where we no longer hate, but now love? How do we love our enemies and expand our beloved community? Stephen Lingwood, a British blogger, recently wrote about beloved community and loving our enemies. In his post, he presents the idea of enemy love, wherein there is clarity presented on the enemy and the violence they are responsible for. It demands the end to violence, but ultimately it refuses to manifest the violence back on the enemy. Ultimately, it responds with love. Lingwood further proposes that we need to be able to recognize the violence within us, the white supremacy within us, the potential dictator within us, the abuser within us, to be able to liberate ourselves from these things. We need to reclaim our human spirit, which we do by acting out of nonviolence and love to enemies. When we love enemies, we also begin to reclaim the human spirit of those that are the vehicles of oppression and violence. An interesting perspective on loving humans who do bad things is to first not demonize those individuals. When a terrorist, for example, is demonized and made into a monster, we are powerless to stop them. Instead, if we keep in our thoughts that these individuals are humans and are not monsters, we can retain hope that those messages of peace and love and acceptance and tolerance can one day be heard. Are those of us who believe we can love or respect or know our enemies and have a true beloved community impractical idealists? Or could it be that we are simply being encouraged to be more compassionate, to be more empathic, to be more understanding? Consider the idea of metta, the first of the 4 Buddhist virtues, which means to care and wish well for another being without judging them, to accept them independently of agreeing or disagreeing with them and without wanting anything from them in return. It is a wish that all sentient beings be well. Metta involves accepting people as they are. While this sounds easy enough in principle, it is fully acknowledged that the practice takes effort and work. One of the most thought-provoking examples of working toward acceptance and love of an enemy is portrayed in Philip Goldberg's book, Spiritual Practices for Crazy Times. Goldberg describes a practice of the late spiritual teacher, Ram Dass. During America's disastrous war in Iraq, Ram Dass was so disturbed by his anger toward George W. Bush that he placed a picture of the president on his altar. Having an out-of-place photo alongside images of his guru and other revered figures reminded him of how far he had to go to see the beloved in everyone. Goldberg adds, and yes, he added a photo of Donald Trump in 2016. I have something similar on my spiritual checklist, but I haven't quite been able to bring myself to place pictures in my sacred places of those I feel less than positive feelings towards. David Stendhal Rast, a Benedictine monk, gives the following examples of how to love our enemies, which I found so real and sincere. Show your enemies the genuine respect that every human being deserves. Learn to think of them with compassion. In cultivating compassion, it may help to visualize your enemies as the children they once were and somehow remain. Do not dispense compassion from above, but meet your enemies in your imagination, always at eye level. Make every effort to come to know and understand them better, their hopes, their fears, concerns, and aspirations. Search for common goals, spell them out, and try to explore together ways of reaching these goals. Don't cling to your own convictions. Examine them in light of your enemy's convictions with all the sincerity you can muster. Invite your enemies to focus on issues. While focusing on the issues at hand, suspend your convictions. Do not judge persons, but look closely at the effect of their actions. Are they building up or endangering the common good? In order to counteract your enemies effectively on a given issue, join the greatest possible variety of like-minded people. Wherever possible, show your enemies kindness. Do them as much good as you can. At least sincerely wish them well. And my favorite, for the rest, Entrust yourself and your enemies to the great mystery of life that has assigned us each such different and often opposing roles, and that will see us through if we play our part with love. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts and ideas today. I hope that you will embrace with me the challenge of facing hate and loving our enemies as we strive towards the vision of beloved community. I know we will discover insecurities and dark parts of ourselves as we do this work, but let's listen together to the messages of those insecurities and dark places and allow them to energize and sustain our growth in love.